Welcome back to the debate between candidates Kevin Cramer, George Sinner, and Jack Seaman, all vying for a spot in the U.S. House in Washington. The question, with annual budgets between $0.5 and $1 trillion, what changes would you make in the federal budget to get closer to a balanced budget? Mr. Cramer, you're up first.
Well, there are two things. There are two sides of the formula. Obviously, there's the revenue side and there's the spending side. And one of the things that the Congress has done over the last 3 years is we've actually cut total spending 3 years in a row, which is the first time that's happened since the Korean War. On the other side, on the revenue side, I certainly don't advocate any tax increases, but I do advocate a flatter, simpler tax code that inspires more economic opportunity. The good thing is that the debt, or deficit, has been brought down from about $1.5 trillion to about I think it's going to be this year about $600 billion. Next year maybe under $500 billion. But until we deal with what one of the earlier questions was about, the Social Security and Medicare issues, and we only have to deal with them by tweaking them a little bit, we're going to have a hard time getting to balance. Once we get to balance, then we can start dealing on the entire debt side of things. But the other thing is that we have to get our economy going. Jobs creation, a vibrant economy, that'll take care of a lot of the ills.
Mr. Sinner.
There is a lot we can do. There are some budget cuts we can do, but we got to come to the table to do that. But there are also some corporate loopholes that we can fix. Recently, I rolled out a program that actually incented small businesses and farmers to invest in their businesses. To pay for that, I brought together a program that eliminated some loopholes for major multi-billion-dollar overseas corporations. And one of them was called the inversion tax. And what these companies are doing, these major million-dollar corporations, they're setting up subsidiaries in foreign companies, and they leave that income there without bringing it back. Yet, they enjoy being under the umbrella of the U.S. military, protecting all of the transmission, all of the transfer of goods around the world. And yet, they don't do what they really should do and bring that income back to their home corporation and pay the U.S. tax. And they only have to pay the difference between the taxing entity where they were and the U.S. tax code.
Jack Seaman.
I think that balancing the budget can't be that difficult. I mean, we all sit around our kitchen tables and balance our budget as family, and we know what's in the checking account. We know when we're overdrawn. We know what our credit card limit is. So I don't know why it's so difficult in Washington. I can't wait to find out. But that being said, there's some simple things. There's some simple solutions we could offer to help balance the budget, stuff that we don't need to keep wasting money on. Let me throw out just a couple examples that came to the top of my head here, and I wrote them down. How about we cut corporate welfare? Let's stop bailing out businesses with billion-dollar bailouts. How about cutting foreign aid? We don't need to be sending billions of dollars around the globe when we have 47 million Americans on food stamps here at home. How about ending the failed war on drugs? That's a horrible policy that we sunk $1 trillion into with nothing to show for it. How about ending the IRS once and for all and passing the fair tax, which would be a huge transfer of wealth from the government to the people? There's lots of stuff out there. If I go to Washington, I won't vote for an unbalanced budget, unlike my opponent, Mr. Cramer, did.
Ironically, the rebuttal from Kevin Cramer.
Well, interestingly, I actually voted for a balanced budget, but that said, the Senate didn't concur, so we ended up with the budget that we have. With regard to the 179 expensing deduction that George referred to as his idea, we actually passed that in the House of Representatives not once but twice this summer. The Senate has just chosen not to take it up, making that a permanent deduction for businesses to incent them to make purchases now. The other idea he had about an inversion penalty, you can't penalize companies for doing the things that allow them to keep their money overseas. You have to create a tax code that makes it more feasible for them to bring it back, lest you push their whole corporate headquarters overseas. So I'm for a territorial tax.
Our next question comes from our cameras on the streets and funding education in North Dakota.
My name is Yechun Wang from West Fargo, and my question would be, would there be more funding put into education, especially higher education in North Dakota?
Mr. Sinner.
Yes, I believe there should. And here's why. North Dakota students graduate with the highest amount of student debt in the nation at almost $27,000 a year of debt. And that's 83% of North Dakota students. When I was in the North Dakota Senate, I recognized this problem and proposed a bill that allowed them to consolidate their loans and lower the interest rates. And the bill passed and became a bipartisan bill. Recently, I proposed to do the same thing on a federal level. And what it did was it indexed Pell Grants to the increasing tuition. It also lowered the interest rate on student loans. And finally, it allowed graduates to consolidate their loans and put them all in one package and reduce their rate. Now, I just don't understand today why I can get a mortgage on my house for 15 years at 2.5%, but yet at the same time, we're making our students pay almost 7 and 8%.
Jack Seaman.
Obviously, the cost of going to college these days is a big issue around the country and here in North Dakota. And the reason that the costs are up is because demand is up. And what's driving demand? Well, a lot of hot money is entering the student loan system. That's driving a lot of demand. If you can get a lot of money easily with low interest rates, why not take it? The problem is we have a big dropout rate too. Nationally, it's around 40%. So we have students that are taking out big loans, and then they're not graduating, and then they're getting lower paying jobs, but they still incur the high student loan debt. I think this conversation needs to happen around a family's kitchen table and decide, is my son or is my daughter really need to go to college? Would it be best to put them in an apprenticeship program or maybe a journeyman or some other 2-year technical college? Maybe some of these decisions sound crazy to you, but they make sense to me because where I came from, not every single student was required or should be at college. There's so many different ways to pursue a career. If you take the demand out of the system, then the prices will fall. And as far as George and all his spending, I don't hear him talking about offsetting cuts at all.
Mr. Cramer.
Well, I have to say I agree with pretty much everything that Jack just said, and what George just outlined would do 3 things. It would raise student debt, it would raise the federal debt, and it would raise the cost of tuition. Indexing Pell Grants to the cost of tuition is like calling every president of every university in America and saying, go ahead and raise your tuition rates, we're going to cover it for you. Setting an arbitrarily low interest rate and making sure that the taxpayers will subsidize it will only incur more debt for the student and more debt for the country. What we need to get at is the cost side, not the flow of money side, but the cost side. That's why last year we passed, and when I say we, I mean by a vote of 392 to 31, the Student Loan Certainty Act that does many of the things George talks about, but we tie the low rate to the Treasury note with an 8.5% cap over time if it should ever go that high. Right now I think it's about 3.9%. That's much more market oriented, protects students, but also incents to keep the tuition costs down.
Mr. Sinner, a rebuttal?
Yeah, what Congressman Cramer really talks about is, and what he said in a press release was that this was a perverse incentive to college students. Well, I don't know any perverse college students. I don't, maybe you do, Kevin, but I don't. What Kevin Cramer talks about and what he talked about, and we go back to the shutdown of 2013 that cost this economy $24 billion. That's money that could have gone to these students nationwide and could have lowered all of the debt across the nation by 2%. Now, let's face it, folks, there are answers, but we've got to work together.
And now an almost $2 billion question, the proposed FM diversion project. President Obama signed the Water Resources Reform and Development Act authorizing $800 million federal dollars for the project. Congress still has to approve that money. Lately, Minnesota Governor Dayton has urged the government to stop the project. What are your views on the diversion? If you're for it, what would you do to get funding approved? Mr. Seaman, you go first.
I stood on stage in Bismarck on May 1st in our first debate of many that we're going to have in this race, and I told the crowd assembled there that I am not a supporter of the diversion in its current form. And I'm still not a supporter of the diversion in its current form. And by the way, anybody that thinks that this thing's going to cost $2 billion needs to readjust their thinking a little bit, because that $2 billion is going to turn into 3 or 4 really quick. The bottom line is, if you're going to spend that much money, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, you need to make sure that every single person that this project affects is satisfied with the project moving forward. We do not have that right now. We have a large amount of people directly to our south that is going to have their family fields flooded, cemeteries flooded, land that they've worked forever flooded. They're not satisfied with that. They don't want that. And if we're spending this much money, I think that there's got to be a way that we can find a plan that works better for everyone. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying we don't need flood protection. I'm saying there's a better plan out there. So let's find it.
Congressman Cramer.
So the one R in Water Resources Reform and Development Act is reform. And one of the reforms that we were able to put into the law before we passed it this last year, or this current year, was to allow local, state, and frankly any non-federal entities to come up with financing to finish a project. We're in a unique position in North Dakota to be able to do some of that. In the meantime, we are also trying to get the funding for it from the federal government on the federal side, but allowing the project to go ahead without that. Very important flexibility. On the federal side, I will tell you this, it's not like there are a bunch of congressmen lining up to fund a diversion around Fargo. Therefore, we can't afford to have these border fights with Minnesota, nor can we afford, frankly, to have the type of fight we're having with the upstream citizens. We need to work through these things at the local level, because things like federal lawsuits and states arguing with each other make it very difficult for the only member in a body of 435 to get funding. That said, we provided some reforms and some flexibility to allow the project to move ahead.
Mr. Sinner.
Well, I fully support the FM diversion in its current form. And here's why. Fargo has been fighting floods for way too many years. There's no question that Fargo needs permanent flood protection. This is the most studied project in the history of North Dakota. We need to find a solution for Fargo's problem. That said, we also need to make sure that we do everything to ensure that it is the best project, and also make sure that all of the people that are affected, everyone, gets compensated fairly to make sure that they can continue their lives as they have today.
Mr. Seaman, a rebuttal?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that was just an echo of everything I said. But he doesn't support it in its current form. But everything I said was something else that George agreed to. So that's good. We're in agreement on that. Okay. It's not the right project. When you have people that are going to be displaced, we need to find a way to not displace them. With this kind of money that we're spending and the kind of minds that are involved in this, come on, we can put people on the moon, but we can't figure out how to build a diversion without having a large group of people disenfranchised with the project. I think we can do better, and the MNDAC Upstream Coalition can help us do better.
Still to come tonight, why should you vote for one of these candidates? Closing statements from Kevin Cramer, George Sinner, and Jack Seaman are next.